America woke up angry on April 5, 2025. The sun rose over a nation already buzzing with tension, as millions of Americans scrolled through their phones, reading headlines that would shape the day. The news was everywhere, on social media, in group chats, on the lips of neighbors and co-workers. It was clear, something unprecedented was about to unfold. Millions took to the streets, from bustling cities to quiet towns. In every corner of the country, people poured out of their homes driven by a shared sense of urgency and outrage. The energy was palpable, as if the entire nation had been holding its breath and was now exhaling in unison. This was the hands-off protest, a nationwide outcry against the Trump administration and its controversial policies. The movement had been brewing for weeks, sparked by proposed changes to Social Security, healthcare, and civil rights protections. But it was more than just a reaction to policy. It was a response to a growing sense of alienation, a feeling that the voices of ordinary Americans were being ignored. Organizers claimed millions participated, spanning all 50 states. From the Pacific Coast to the Atlantic, from the heartland to the Deep South, the hands-off movement united people across political, racial, and generational lines. The sheer scale of the mobilization was staggering, with rallies erupting in places that had rarely seen such activism before. News outlets buzzed with images of overflowing crowds. Television screens flickered with live footage of packed city squares, while reporters struggled to keep up with the rapidly unfolding events. Social media feeds became a torrent of photos, videos, and first-hand accounts, amplifying the sense of solidarity and urgency. Washington, D.C. alone saw tens of thousands, with some estimates exceeding 100,000. The National Mall became a sea of signs and voices, as people from across the country converged on the nation's capital to make their demands heard. The air was thick with chants, songs, and the steady drumbeat of determination. This wasn't just a protest, it was a collective roar of frustration, a demand for change echoing across the nation. The chants of "hands off" and "this is what democracy looks like" reverberated through city streets and rural highways alike, uniting strangers in a common cause. The scale of the hands-off protests was unprecedented. Never before had so many Americans mobilized against a sitting government in recent history. The sheer numbers dwarfed previous demonstrations, drawing comparisons to the largest marches of the past, but with a new sense of urgency and inclusivity. The sheer volume of protesters, stretching for blocks on end, painted a stark picture of a nation deeply divided and disillusioned. Police barricades separated crowds, but the determination on both sides of the line was unmistakable. For many, this was not just a protest, it was a reckoning, a moment to confront the realities of a fractured democracy. This wasn't just about politics anymore, it was about the very soul of America, about the values it held dear and the future it envisioned for itself. Protesters waved American flags not as symbols of division but as emblems of hope and unity. Their signs spoke of freedom, justice, and the promise of a better tomorrow. The protests were a testament to the power of collective action, a resounding affirmation that the American spirit of dissent was alive and well. In city after city, people locked arms, chanted together, and found strength in their shared purpose. The sense of community was overwhelming, as strangers became allies in the fight for their rights. From seasoned activists to first-time protesters, people from all walks of life united under the banner of "Hands Off." Grandparents marched alongside grandchildren, and young people found their voices for the first time. The movement transcended age, background, and ideology, forging unlikely alliances in the name of justice. They were teachers, nurses, veterans, students, and retirees, ordinary citizens who felt compelled to take a stand against what they perceived as an assault on their livelihoods and their freedoms. Each group brought its own stories and struggles, but all were united by a common conviction that their voices mattered, and that silence was no longer an option. The sheer diversity of the protesters, mirroring the multifaceted tapestry of American society, underscored the widespread nature of the grievances. People of every race, religion, and background stood shoulder to shoulder, their differences eclipsed by a shared determination to protect the rights and values they cherished. Volunteers worked tirelessly behind the scenes, handing out water and snacks, tending to minor injuries, and ensuring that everyone's rights were protected. Legal observers mingled with the crowds, documenting events and offering support. The sense of solidarity extended beyond the marches themselves, creating a network of care and mutual aid. Families brought their children, turning the protests into teachable moments about democracy and civic responsibility. Young kids drew chalk art on sidewalks, their messages of hope and unity, adding color to the movement. For many, it was a day that would be remembered for generations, a day when ordinary people stood up for what they believed in. This wasn't just about one issue, one policy, or one demographic. It was about a fundamental disconnect between the government and the governed, a growing sense that the administration was out of touch with the needs and aspirations of the people it claimed to represent. As politicians looked out from their offices, they saw not just a crowd, but a movement, one that would not be easily silenced or ignored. What drove so many Americans to the streets? What was it that transformed ordinary citizens, teachers, nurses, veterans, students, parents, into a sea of voices demanding change? The answer is complex, rooted in years of mounting frustration and a sense that the very fabric of American society was being pulled apart. The answer was a potent cocktail of anger, fear, and disillusionment. For many, it felt as if the country they loved was slipping away, replaced by something unrecognizable. The air was thick with anxiety, and every new headline seemed to deepen the sense of crisis. The Trump administration, now in its 8th year, had implemented a series of controversial policies. Each new executive order, each press conference seemed to widen the divide between the government and the governed. The sense of alienation grew, as did the determination to push back. These policies, coupled with the increasing influence of tech mogul Elon Musk in government affairs, ignited a firestorm of opposition. Musk's rise from entrepreneur to political power broker was seen by many as a symbol of how the lines between business and government had blurred, raising fears about unchecked corporate influence over public policy. At the heart of the protests was a deep-seated anxiety about economic insecurity. Decades of stagnant wages, rising costs of living, and the erosion of stable jobs had left millions feeling left behind. The promise that hard work would lead to a better life seemed increasingly hollow. Cuts to Social Security, veterans' benefits, and Medicaid had left millions of Americans feeling vulnerable and betrayed. For seniors and those who had served their country, these programs were lifelines. Their reduction or removal was not just a policy change, it was a personal blow, a signal that their sacrifices and contributions were being forgotten. The administration's aggressive deregulation policies were seen as favoring corporations and the wealthy at the expense of ordinary citizens. Environmental protections were rolled back, labor rights weakened, and tax breaks flowed to the top. Many felt that the government was no longer working for the people but for the powerful few. The gap between the haves and the have-nots seemed to be widening, and the American dream felt increasingly out of reach for many. The sight of luxury developments rising next to crumbling neighborhoods became a daily reminder of growing inequality. For young people, the dream of homeownership or a secure future seemed more distant than ever. Adding fuel to the fire were concerns about the erosion of democratic norms and the curtailing of civil liberties. The right to protest, to speak freely, to participate in fair elections. These were seen as under threat. Many feared that the foundational principles of American democracy were being chipped away, piece by piece. The administration's attacks on the free press, its attempts to undermine the judiciary, and its crackdown on immigration had raised alarm bells across the political spectrum. Journalists faced intimidation, judges were publicly disparaged, and families were separated at the border. These actions were not isolated. They were part of a broader pattern that many saw as deeply troubling. Many protesters saw these actions as a slippery slope towards authoritarianism, a betrayal of the fundamental principles upon which America was founded. The specter of history loomed large, with echoes of past struggles for freedom and justice fueling the determination to resist. The hands-off protests were a culmination of years of simmering discontent, a boiling point reached after years of witnessing the erosion of their rights and the dismantling of the social safety net. What began as scattered demonstrations had grown into a nationwide movement, uniting people from all walks of life in a common cause. It was a cry for accountability, a demand for the government to address the real concerns of its citizens, instead of catering to the interests of a select few. In the chants, the signs, and the determined faces, there was a message that could not be ignored. The people were ready to reclaim their voice, and they would not be silenced. The Trump administration's actions leading up to the protests painted a picture of a government seemingly at odds with its people. Across the country, a sense of unease grew as policies were enacted that many felt undermined the very foundations of American society. The divide between the administration and large segments of the public became increasingly pronounced, fueling a wave of activism and dissent that would soon spill into the streets. Cuts to vital social safety net programs like Social Security and Medicare were enacted under the banner of fiscal responsibility. The administration argued that these measures were necessary to reduce the federal deficit and ensure the long-term sustainability of these programs. However, for millions of Americans, especially seniors and those with disabilities, these cuts represented a direct threat to their well-being and security. However, critics argued that these cuts disproportionately impacted the most vulnerable segments of society, pushing millions closer to the brink of poverty. For many, the loss of benefits meant choosing between paying for medication, rent, or food. The anxiety and fear among those dependent on these programs was palpable, as rallies and protests erupted in cities and towns nationwide. The administration's zeal for deregulation extended far beyond the realm of finance. Sweeping changes were made to policies that had long protected consumers, workers, and the environment. Supporters claimed that rolling back regulations would unleash innovation and spur economic growth, but opponents warned of dire consequences. Environmental protections were rolled back, with regulations on clean air and water loosened or eliminated. This sparked outrage among environmentalists, scientists, and communities living near polluting industries, who feared for their health and the future of the planet. Consumer safety regulations were weakened, making it easier for corporations to market products without rigorous oversight. This raised concerns about the safety of everything from children's toys to prescription drugs, and left many feeling unprotected in the marketplace. And labor rights were undermined, as protections for workers were scaled back. Unions and labor advocates warned that these changes would erode hard-won gains in workplace safety, fair wages, and collective bargaining. Critics argued that these actions benefited corporations at the expense of public health, safety, and the environment. The sense that profit was being prioritized over people galvanized a broad coalition of activists, from healthcare advocates to environmentalists who joined forces in protest. The administration's response was that these measures were necessary to unleash economic growth, a claim disputed by many economists. While some pointed to short-term gains in the stock market, others warned that the long-term costs, both human and environmental, would far outweigh any temporary benefits. Perhaps most alarming to many Americans was the administration's apparent disregard for democratic norms and civil liberties. The use of inflammatory rhetoric, the targeting of political opponents, and the erosion of long-standing checks and balances all contributed to a growing sense of crisis. Attacks on the free press became more frequent and brazen, with journalists labeled as enemies and news organizations threatened with legal action. This assault on the media was seen by many as an attack on the very principle of a free and open society. Attempts to influence the judiciary, including efforts to appoint loyalists to key positions and undermine judicial independence, raised alarms among legal scholars and civil rights advocates. And the use of executive orders to circumvent Congress raised serious concerns about the future of American democracy. Many feared that the balance of power was shifting dangerously toward the executive branch, threatening the constitutional order. The administration's crackdown on immigration, including the separation of families at the border, became a flashpoint for national outrage. Heart-wrenching images of children in detention centers shocked the conscience of the nation and the world. The implementation of restrictive immigration policies sparked outrage and condemnation both domestically and internationally. Protests erupted not only across the United States but in cities around the globe, as people demanded a return to compassion, justice, and respect for human rights.